My own family disowned me. You never brought anything good to this family, Dad said. I felt the ground sink beneath me, but I stayed calm and walked away to never return. Too bad they didn't know about the secret business I owned. Now 2 years later they're begging me. I should have known what was coming. The way my father's tone became piercing when he addressed me, the way my mother's eyes quickly shifted away as soon as I entered the room, the way my siblings exchanged quiet remarks behind my back, their laughter dissipating the moment I drew near. Somehow, though, I wasn't prepared. Not for the instant when my father, the man meant to be my protector, fixed his gaze on me and declared, "You've never brought anything worthwhile into this family." His words hit me like a brutal blow. My breath caught, and for a moment, I felt as if the floor beneath me were tilting. There I was in the middle of our family's living room, yet I suddenly felt like a stranger in my own home. My mother stood next to him, arms tightly folded over her chest and lips set in a thin line of disapproval. My younger brother lounged on the couch with his arms draped casually over the backrest, watching the whole scene unfold as if it were a low-budget soap opera, while my older sister, Stephanie, barely glanced up from her phone. I managed to choke out, "Dad, what are you talking about?" Only to see his face twist as though even my question was an insult. "Exactly what I said, Alyssa," he sighed, as if I were wearing him out. "You've never done anything to help this family. You're a burden, a complete waste of time." I had to force myself to breathe. Was it because I didn't yet have a high-paying job? My voice remained calm, though inside my heart pounded furiously. I had been working relentlessly, pulling long hours, juggling side gigs, and absorbing every bit of knowledge I could. I was constructing something of my own, something they couldn't even comprehend, but to them it meant nothing. Then my mother finally spoke. "It's not solely about the money, Alyssa. It's about you. You've always been difficult. Her words stung far more than I'd expected. "Oh, you mean difficult as in not doing everything you demand? Difficult as in striving to live my own life rather than serving you?" My father's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone," he snapped. I exhaled sharply, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "I work hard. I'm responsible. I've never asked for anything, yet you insist I contribute nothing of value." He continued, "Look at Stephanie, she has a secure career. And Michael, he's got his life all figured out. But you? You're busy chasing after things that will lead nowhere." I glanced at my sister, who still hadn't looked up from her phone. Sure, she had a stable career, but only because Dad pulled strings for her. And Michael? He never had to earn a thing. Everything was simply handed to him. Meanwhile, I had forged everything on my own, and in their eyes I was utterly insignificant. My father shook his head. "We've given you every opportunity, and you've thrown them away. We're done wasting time on you." I stared at him, my breathing measured and slow. "So what exactly are you saying?" I asked. My father folded his arms. "We're saying we're done." My mother exhaled as if a heavy burden had been lifted. "You should leave, Alyssa." For a long second my heartbeat slowed, and the room blurred around me, the voices fading into a low hum. They were serious. This wasn't mere anger or an empty threat. They were disowning me. In that moment memories flooded back. The years I had desperately sought their approval, the countless late nights spent aiding my overwhelmed mother, the times I stayed up to comfort my sister after her relationships crumbled, even the money I had lent my brother when he spent recklessly. None of it had mattered to them. I had never mattered. I straightened my shoulders. I wasn't about to plead for forgiveness. "All right." My father raised an eyebrow. "All right." I repeated, my voice steady. "I'll leave." For the first time my sister looked up from her phone. My brother blinked, clearly surprised that I was actually following through. Even my mother hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around her wrist. But I didn't give them a chance to change their minds. I turned, walked to the front door, and placed my hand on the knob. Then, for the first time in my life, I looked back over my shoulder, and I wasn't afraid. "You'll regret this," my father scoffed. "Don't be so dramatic." I almost laughed. They had no idea. They couldn't fathom that over the past few years I had been quietly building something of my own. They assumed they were cutting me off, but in truth I was the one severing ties. Stepping outside, the cold air hit my skin and I walked away, feeling free for the first time. 2 years later they came crawling back. Walking away had been the easy part, What followed was the true test. That night, I left my parents' house with nothing more than a single suitcase and the crushing weight of their rejection. No job was waiting for me, no safety net, no clear plan for what came next, but I had one asset: determination and of course my secret business. It wasn't much at first, just an online store I'd been running on the side for 2 years. Initially, progress was slow, barely enough to make ends meet, but gradually I learned how to market, sell, and scale. What began as a small venture soon showed promise, and I was ready to wager everything on it. The early months were brutal. I crashed on my best friend Rachel's couch for weeks while I sorted things out. I took on freelance gigs, burned the midnight oil, and scraped by. Some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if my father had been right, if I truly was destined for nothing. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself I wouldn't prove him right. I worked harder than ever, pouring every waking moment into growing my business. I studied marketing strategies, honed my products, expanded my network, and slowly things began to change. Sales increased, customers returned, and the numbers steadily climbed. Then, just 6 months after I walked away from my so-called family, I checked my bank account and saw something I'd never seen before. A 5-figure balance. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. By the end of that first year, my modest side hustle had transformed into a legitimate company. I moved out of Rachel's place into my own apartment, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I finally afforded the things I'd always desired but never could have. And best of all, I did it entirely on my own. No handouts, no shortcuts, no family support. Yet even after all of that, their words still echoed in my mind. You never brought anything good to this family. I wanted to erase them from my life, to forget everything, but deep down I sensed that one day they would return. And when they did, I would be ready. It was 2 years in when the first message arrived. A simple text from an unknown number. Dad. Alyssa, we need to talk. I stared at the screen, my stomach knotting. For 2 long years I'd heard nothing from them. No birthday wishes, no check-ins, not even a cold, passive-aggressive text from my mother. And now suddenly they needed something. I ignored it. A week later another message came. Mom, it's important. Please call us, please. That word almost made me laugh. Now they wanted to be polite? Still I didn't respond. Then came a phone call, another from Mom, and eventually a voicemail. My mother's voice trembled, almost unrecognizable. Alyssa, please, we're struggling. Your father lost his job. The house is in jeopardy. We don't know what to do. I sat there, heart hammering, as they explained how everything was falling apart. The same people who had once looked me in the eye and declared I was worthless, who had cast me aside like I meant nothing, were now pleading for my help. I tapped my fingers on the table, reminding myself that I should have felt guilty or remorseful, but all I felt was a cold satisfaction. They thought they could break me, they assumed I would fail. They had no idea who I was up against. I hovered my finger over the call button on my phone. Not yet, I wanted them to experience what it was like to feel powerless. I let them stew for 2 weeks, ignoring their messages, missed calls, and voicemails that piled up day after day. I watched as desperate pleas from the very people who once dismissed me lit up my screen. It was strangely poetic. For years I had craved their approval, contorting myself to fit into the mold they had set for me. And now they were the ones waiting on me. I held all the power and I intended to use it. After the 15th voicemail from my mother, one that teetered on the edge of tears, I finally decided it was time for them to hear my voice. I called back. The moment my mother answered, she drew a sharp breath. Alyssa. Her voice was small and fragile. I leaned back in my chair, gazing out at the city skyline from my office window, the office in a building I owned, built for my own success. Took you long enough, I said. She hesitated. We weren't sure you'd answer. I admitted. I wasn't sure either. There was a heavy pause before she cleared her throat. Alyssa, things have been difficult. Your father. He lost his job. My voice remained flat, devoid of emotion. I inhaled sharply and almost laughed. Who told you that? I asked. It's amazing what you learn when people start crawling back into your life. She sighed, her tone void of anger, only exhaustion. Alyssa, we need your help. Don't you remember? 2 years ago you made it clear you were nothing to this family. A burden, a waste of time. So why would you want to help us now? There was silence, then a broken whisper. We were wrong. For the first time my mother was admitting fault, but was it genuine or merely desperation? She continued, voice trembling as she recounted everything. Dad lost his job 6 months ago. The severance barely lasted. Bills piled up, Stephanie was laid off, and Michael, who never had to struggle, had nothing to offer. Their world was crumbling, and I was apparently their last hope. I should have felt remorse, but all I tasted was the bitter irony of it all. Now I was valuable, now I mattered. I let her finish her account before I spoke. And what does he have to say? She asked hesitantly. He wants to talk to you, she continued. I almost laughed. This was the same man who had once looked me in the eye and told me I was worthless, the very man who had cast me out without a second thought, and now he wanted a conversation. Interesting, I murmured. I exhaled and put him on hold. There was a shuffle, muffled voices, and then my father's voice, stern yet noticeably different, less harsh and almost feeble. I let the silence linger before responding. Dad. There was a pause and then, we need your help. That was it. No sugarcoating, no pleasantries, just a straightforward plea from a man who had once regarded me as nothing. I could almost hear his frustration in the sigh that followed. I know you're angry, I said with a short laugh. Angry isn't exactly the right word, but fine, let's go with that. Another pause, then he exhaled sharply, his tone softening into something nearly apologetic. We made mistakes, as if what we did was a minor error in judgment. As if discarding you like garbage was simply a regrettable misstep. I wasn't going to let him off the hook. No, Dad, you didn't just make mistakes, you made a choice. The impact of my words was palpable. I could hear his breathing catch as if he hadn't expected such blunt honesty. You chose to push me away, to cut me off, and now you're only calling because you've run out of options. After a long pause, he finally murmured, I was wrong. That confession, a rare moment of vulnerability from the man who had spent his life acting superior, hung heavily in the air. Regret wasn't part of it, it was survival. They didn't long for my return or feel remorse for their actions. They were merely desperate, and that desperation made this moment all the more perfect. I drew in a slow breath, letting the newfound power settle deep within me, then smirked and said, I'll think about it, before hanging up. I knew they'd call again. No sooner had I ended the call than my phone buzzed with another. From my father, then my mother, then my sister. I sent them straight to voicemail, letting them stew. For 2 years I had meant nothing to them, and now their desperation was intoxicating. But I wasn't content with simply savoring the moment. I intended to use it, to show them that this wasn't about money, but about making them understand. I waited another 2 days before answering my mother's call. When I finally picked up, her voice came out in a shaky whisper. Alyssa. Filled with relief as if she had been waiting forever. I'll help you, she murmured, the words hitting like a bomb. What? My mother's voice cracked. I'll help you, she repeated, measured yet hesitant. But on my terms, I replied coolly. She fumbled over her words. Of course, anything, Alyssa. We just need. Before she could finish, I interrupted. I want a meeting. Face to face with you, Dad, Stephanie, and Michael. No excuses. After a pause, she agreed. I arranged the meeting not at their house but at a sleek, upscale restaurant downtown, one that required reservations weeks ahead, a place they could never afford now. When I walked in, I saw them immediately. They looked uneasy. My mother's hands were clasped tightly on the table, her eyes darting around as if she didn't belong. My father sat rigidly, his jaw set, his pride barely intact. Stephanie tapped her nails irritably, and Michael slumped silently in his chair. As I took my seat, I felt the shift. Suddenly, I wasn't the outsider. I set my phone aside and let silence linger before saying, Let's cut to the chase. My father's jaw twitched as he began. Alyssa, I held up a hand. Listen, you need money. I stated it plainly. No pity, no sympathy, just facts. My father exhaled sharply and nodded. We just need some help getting back on our feet, my mother added softly. And we'll pay you back, of course. I smiled thinly. You must think I'm an idiot. My father recoiled, and Stephanie's mouth fell slightly. You want my money? I leaned forward calmly. Then I want something in return. My father frowned. Alyssa, you're still our family. You stopped being our daughter when you left. A sharp silence followed. Stephanie scoffed. Are you really holding a grudge? That was years ago. I fixed her with a cold stare. If you lost everything tomorrow, would you expect me to help? She hesitated. Well, yes. Why? I pressed. Because we're family. I smirked. Exactly. But remember when I had nothing, you left me out in the cold. Stephanie had no reply. I'll give you the money, I declared at last. But there are conditions. My mother exhaled a shaky sigh of relief, and my father's shoulders slumped slightly. Here's the deal, I continued. His face darkened. Alyssa, we're not here to make deals. I cut him off, gesturing toward the door. Go beg someone else. They were silent, of course they had no other options. I folded my hands on the table. I don't do loans. If I give you money, I own something in return. My father tensed. Own something? What do you mean? I shrugged. Your house. My mother gasped. Alyssa, no, you need money and I need investments. So here's the deal. I'll buy the house at fair market value. You can stay for now, pay me rent, and if you ever default, I tilted my head. You leave. Shock flickered across their faces. They had assumed I'd just hand over cash like a naive girl still desperate for their love. Not anymore. My father's hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I smiled. Then find another option. There was nothing they could do, for no alternative existed. My mother swallowed hard. We need time to think. I stood, grabbed my bag and said, take all the time you want, but the deal expires in 24 hours. My father's jaw tightened. My sister glared. My brother, quiet as ever, kept his eyes fixed on the table. I took one last look at them. The very people who had once discarded me like trash were now at my mercy, and I relished every second. I walked out without looking back. I knew they wouldn't accept the deal easily. Pride keeps people from asking for help when they need it most. In my father's case, it made him rather stubborn than admit I held the upper hand. So it wasn't surprising when 24 hours passed without a single call or message. I knew their silence wasn't surrender. It was resistance. A final attempt to cling to the scraps of control they had left. What they didn't know was that I had already planned for this. 2 days later, my mother finally called. Alyssa, we need to talk. I smirked. I figured you would. She hesitated. Can we meet? I paused before replying smoothly. What, we already met. I gave you the deal. It's not my job to chase you for an answer. I heard the exhaustion in her sigh. Your father, she started then stopped. What about him? I asked. He doesn't want to take the deal. I laughed. Of course he doesn't. Then what does he expect? That I simply hand him money out of the kindness of my heart. Silence said it all. I exhaled sharply. Wow, he really doesn't get it, does he? Alyssa, please. My voice was firm. I don't owe him anything. If he won't accept the deal, he can figure out another way to cover his bills. There was a long pause, then softly. Alyssa, he's sick. I repeated, sick. The word hung between us. Heavy and unexpected. What do you mean, sick? My mother sighed, her voice laced with deep exhaustion. He hasn't told anyone outside the family, but he was diagnosed last year with a heart condition. It's worsening. I blinked, my mind racing as I tried to decide if it even mattered. This was the same man who had kicked me out, who had told me I was worthless. The same man too proud to accept my help because it meant admitting he needed me. I was supposed to feel sympathy, but instead I exhaled slowly and asked, why are you telling me this now? She hesitated, her voice breaking. Maybe you'll understand why it's so hard for him to accept help from you. I closed my eyes. It was the same tired excuse my mother always used. He's just stressed, he only wants what's best for us. I clenched my jaw. So let me get this straight, he's willing to lose everything. His house, his stability, his dignity. All because his ego won't let him accept my help? She hesitated. It's not that simple. No, Mom, I said sharply. It is, and it's pathetic. Her breath hitched. I'm not softening for you anymore. He has 24 hours to accept the deal. After that, I'm done. Alyssa, no, she pleaded. I cut her off. If his pride matters more than his family, that's on him. I hung up. And this time I didn't wait for a return call. The next day I received a text, not from my mother, not from my father, but from Stephanie. Stephanie, Dad signed the papers. I exhaled slowly. That was it. After years of fighting, after acting as if he would rather die than admit he needed me, he finally gave in. I had won, and yet I felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, just a cold, empty victory. We met one final time, this time in my lawyer's office. The house was legally mine now, the deal set in ink. My father refused to meet my gaze as he signed the final documents, his jaw tight, his signature rough and angry. My mother looked utterly defeated, her shoulders drooping, and my siblings remained silent. This was the moment they realized I was no longer the same Alyssa they had once discarded. I had outgrown them, surpassed them, and now I owned everything they had left. A week after the papers were signed, another text arrived, from Michael. Michael, Dad isn't doing well, you should come by. I stared at the screen for a long time because for the first time I realized I had everything I'd ever wanted. The power, the success, the control, and yet I wasn't sure if I had truly won. I sat in my office rereading Michael's text. For 2 long years I'd waited for this moment, the moment when my family would finally need me, when they'd realize I was the one they should have valued all along. And now that it had come, I didn't feel the satisfaction, the twisted justice, or the ultimate victory I had expected. Instead, all I felt was weariness, for winning had come at a steep price. I had spent years fighting for their approval and then fighting to prove I didn't need it. I had built my life from nothing, forged my success with my own hands, and now I held all the power, their future in my grasp. For the first time I wasn't even sure I wanted it. I drove back to the house where I once lived. It looked different now, smaller, worn down, with an overgrown yard and peeling paint along the edges. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and I was just seeing it through new eyes. I knocked and the door opened slowly. My mother stood there, eyes widening in surprise. "Alyssa," she whispered. I said nothing. I simply stepped into the living room. Everything, the old couch, the faded curtains, the family photos, remained, except now it wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine and everyone knew it. I walked past my mother without a word, heading toward my father's room down the hall. When I stepped inside, I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. He looked smaller than I remembered, older, weaker. A man who had once towered over me, whose words had cut like knives, now appeared as nothing more than a tired, ailing shadow. He turned his head slightly upon noticing me, said nothing, and then softly, "So you finally came." I crossed my arms. "You didn't think I'd waste my time, did you?" I offered a dry chuckle. "Funny, you once told me I was the one wasting time, that I had nothing to offer." His lips pressed together. He knew exactly what I was doing. I wanted him to admit it, to say it aloud, but instead he just sighed. "I suppose you're here to gloat," he murmured. I tilted my head. Would it matter if I was? His expression darkened, and for a brief second, I saw the old man who had disowned me, the one who had stood in this very house and told me I was nothing. But that man was gone. Now he was just a shell. And I realized then I didn't need to win because I already had. I was done fighting ghosts. Stepping forward, I placed a sheet of paper on the nightstand beside him. He frowned as he glanced at it. "What's this?" he asked. "The deed to the house," I replied simply. "I signed it over to Mom." His head snapped up, eyes widening. "What?" I shrugged. "You wanted it, it's yours. You'll have to work out the rest on your own." I turned and walked toward the door. "Wait," he said, his voice now different, not angry or arrogant but broken. "Why?" I didn't turn back. "I don't need this anymore, Alyssa." I paused, meeting his gaze steadily. "You spent your whole life believing that power meant control, that it meant keeping others small so you could feel big. Real power is knowing you no longer have to prove anything." His lips parted slightly, but no words followed. I didn't wait for him to speak. I walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of their lives for good. That night I drove home with the windows down, letting the cool air rush over me. For years I had believed that revenge would make everything right, that if I made them suffer, it would somehow undo all the pain they had inflicted. But the truth was they were already suffering, not because of me but because of who they were. Their pride had kept them small. Their choices had left them miserable. And here I was with everything I'd ever wanted. A life of my own, a future free of them. For the first time in years I felt light-free. I wasn't my past, I wasn't their mistake, I wasn't their failure. I was my own victory. And that, in the end, was enough after that night. As I drove home with the windows rolled down and the cool air washing over me, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle in my chest, a calm that had eluded me for so long. The road stretched out ahead like a promise of new beginnings. In those quiet hours I allowed my mind to wander back over every painful word, every act of rejection, and every sacrifice I'd made to prove my worth. I realized that for years I'd been chasing validation from people who never cared to see the real me. Now, as I embraced the power of my own choices, a new chapter began, one written on my own terms. The days that followed were a mix of solitude and introspection. I spent long hours in my new office, a bright, minimalist space overlooking the city, where the once familiar hum of self-doubt was gradually replaced by a resolute determination. Every morning, I reminded myself that I was no longer tethered to the expectations or the bitterness of my past. I poured my energy into scaling my business further, innovating new ideas, and exploring opportunities that had once seemed like distant dreams. With each small victory, a new client here, a breakthrough there, the sting of rejection faded a little more. Yet, as success blossomed around me, I couldn't help but wonder about the cost of this liberation. There were moments in the stillness of the night when the emptiness of severed family ties crept in. I would sit by the window of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle, and ask myself if the price of winning was worth the isolation. But then I'd recall the long, bitter years of trying to earn approval from people who never saw my potential. I knew that holding on to their memory meant sacrificing the freedom I had fought so hard to claim. In the weeks that followed, I restructured my life. I began reconnecting with friends who had always believed in me, people who had seen my struggles and cheered my smallest successes. Their support filled the spaces left by my family's absence, and I discovered that real connections are built on mutual respect and understanding, not on a foundation of conditional love. I even started mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing with them the lessons learned from my journey. It was in those mentoring sessions that I realized my greatest success wasn't measured in numbers or property deeds, but in the strength to overcome the wounds of my past and help others do the same. I continued to receive occasional messages from my family, brief, desperate attempts to bridge the gap that had grown so wide. Each message stirred a flicker of old pain, but also a quiet resolve. I responded sparingly, always on my own terms, never allowing their neediness to drag me back into the darkness of old resentments. The memory of that fateful meeting at the restaurant, where I had laid out my conditions with unwavering clarity, became a touchstone for my newfound identity. I had learned that forgiveness was not a gift I owed them, but a liberation I granted myself. I slowly released the burden of having to mend their broken pride, understanding that real healing began with acknowledging my own worth. Months later, I found myself invited to speak at a local conference about entrepreneurship and overcoming personal adversity. Standing before a room full of aspiring business owners, I recounted my journey, from the crushing rejection of my family to the hard-won success of building a company from scratch. I spoke not with bitterness, but with a sincere hope that my story could serve as a beacon for others struggling under the weight of external expectations. In that moment, I realized that I had transformed my pain into power, and in doing so, I had finally found the closure I'd been seeking all these years. At the end of the conference, as people approached me with gratitude and admiration, I felt an overwhelming sense of resolution. I had not only reclaimed my identity, but had also forged a path that was entirely my own. My past, with all its scars and memories, no longer defined me. Instead, it served as a reminder of the strength it took to rise above a legacy of neglect and to build a future filled with promise. One crisp autumn afternoon, I revisited the old neighborhood where I had grown up. The house where I had once felt so diminished now stood as a silent testament to what had been lost and what had been overcome. I walked past it without hesitation, a gentle smile playing on my lips as I acknowledged that my history was merely a chapter in a much larger story, one that I had the power to rewrite. In that moment, I understood that true victory wasn't about exacting revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about liberating myself from the chains of a past that never truly belonged to me. I drove away with a light heart, knowing that I had finally arrived at a place of inner peace. I wasn't defined by my family's rejection, or by their desperate pleas for help. I was defined by my resilience, my creativity, and the choices I had made. And as the road ahead unfolded beneath me, I embraced the future with quiet confidence. A future where I was no longer chasing approval, but instead, living fully as the person I had always been meant to be.